Well, I guess everybody becomes a historian if you live long enough. So a lot of it's memories, but I would think most everybody sitting here knows where Hupp's Hill is. If you don't, raise your hand if you've heard of it. Okay, one person, that's good. Hupp's Hill is what's the area north of Strasburg on Route 11 across from Food Line. I think people now might call it Food Line Hill, but for 150 years it's been known as Hupp's Hill, even before that. So going back, let's see, I wasn't here, but 1733, Strasburg was settled. It was one person, had 7,000 acres. His name was Funk. And he sold 500, 600 acres to Peter Stover. And Peter Stover actually had a son named Jacob Stover, had a son named Peter Stover. He sold 450 acres and to his son, and they created the town of Strasburg. So Strasburg's around 450 acres, which at that time included Main Street, Queen Street, and King Street. That way. The town ended just about where the railroad underpass is. And from there on you were in the country. The spring, which is known as the Town Run right here behind us, does this have a name? I've never heard of it, just Town Run. Okay, Town Run starts at the Hupp Homestead. It's been called the Hupp Homestead ever since the Hupps lived there. So it's, although there was predecessors that may have built that were related to the Hupps. So from about where the railroad underpass is to the spring, it's about 1,000 yards. That was country. From there all the way to Cedar Creek, there wasn't anything, maybe one or two houses. In 1833, a fellow by the name of George Franklin Hupp, who was related by marriage to the Stovers, bought that house, and he built a mansion across the road. It's called the Hupp Mansion. It's still there with the columns. He owned 1,000 acres. He was a very prominent businessman around Strasburg, particularly in the 1800s. Everybody knew him. Everybody owed him money. He was on about every deed that there is as either a trustee or co-signer or something. He was a very prominent businessman. Owned interest in a lot of the ores. The smelting ores and furnaces in the area. And he owned part of his personal property was slaves, like a lot of the gentry was at the time. But north of town, there was three prominent families besides the Hupps then. It was the Bowmans and the Stickley families. And they owned all the property from Strasburg to the Cedar Creek bridges. Those three families. There may have been some smaller homes where the overseers lived and worked. Maybe some family descendants owned some smaller parcels where it was subdivided, but mostly it was just three family owners along Route 11. Anyway, antebellum days was pretty nice for some people, and Strasburg grew, and the railroad came, and sooner or later, guess what happens? There's talk of war. Civil War came, 1861, and Mr. Hupp continued his operations. The other families after the war, seemed to have lost their properties, but he continued. He built the mansion across the road in 1835, and he lived there until he died in 1888, I believe. He was 93 years old. But that's how that area north of Strasburg got his name as Hupp's Hill, because he owned most of the land there. Now, what makes the land important in other areas is that its prominence during the Civil War. It was a very strategic location The town of Strasburg is about, the elevation where we are right now is about 500 feet above sea level. That's 200 feet higher, or 150 feet higher, 750 feet. So you go up there, you can see all over. It's one of the prettiest panoramic views along the Valley Pike or Route 11. And it's not as nice now as it used to be because you could see all the way driving down Route 11. Now you pretty much have to pull over at a stop to see the view to the east. The other thing is Hupp's Hill elevation drops off 200 feet down to Cedar Creek. There's an abrupt drop off. And going, as you know, if you're going up the hill north, it's a pretty steep climb. It's the same climb coming from Middletown from Route 11. It just takes a lot longer. The grade's not quite as high, but it's a pretty steep hill. And in 1861, when Stonewall Jackson, it was called the Great Train Raid, brought because the railroad didn't exist between here and Winchester, or Harper's Ferry even, they had to bring the stolen railroad engines along the Valley Pike, and they carted a lot of them on wagons, took them apart, but some of them they just pulled them with 20 horses or more. In 2011, there was a reenactment of what was called the Great Train Raid. And if you go to the Strasburg Museum, there's a train there, as most of you know, that was a reproduction, but it's there now. And they actually brought a train from Middletown, that railroad engine from Middletown, to the museum. And it was quite an event 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So anyway, the steepness of the hill was a problem, but they were able to engineer it, and I think they only lost one engine off the road. The Valley Pike, as I've referred to already a couple times, was originally, as everybody knows, was the old Indian Trail, and it followed springs along, you know, every so here and there would be a spring, a nice ebullient spring. And of course, we have the one that I was speaking of earlier at the Hupp homestead, probably a couple million gallons a day. If you measure how fast a ball floats down the stream, then you'll know how much water is flowing by.
Is that spring open to the public to see?
I don't think it is.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I've been in there, I've seen it. It's
Yeah.
really interesting.
And I mean, you can just look out here and see how much water is coming out of that spring.
That water is where it comes out.
So,
it's in the basement of a house. It comes up out of the ground and
the
flows out of the house.
of course, the prehistoric times, I'm sure it was a campground for the Indians, and I don't think there's been any actual archaeology done around there, but they have found artifacts in that area around the old Hupp site. That house is probably the first house in Strasburg, or one of the first houses built in Strasburg, particularly after the log cabins were built.
The gun forts
Yeah.
certainly show that there wasn't a lot around to protect them.
So I want to phase over to the Civil War now. In 1861, as I mentioned, there was the Great Train Raid. But before that, because this was the terminus of the railroad, let's put it this way, it was the first place you could get on the railroad going to Manassas Gap if you were coming from Winchester. This is the closest location. It was also, if you were coming from the south, the railroad ended at Mount Jackson or Connicksville. It was the first place you could get on the railroad, off the railroad, and go towards Winchester. So a lot of troops moving into the area came to Strasburg and either marched one way or the other. And the Tennessee Brigade was camped around Strasburg in 1861 for a week. A lot of Alabama regiments, Georgia. They came from all over the south heading towards Winchester to protect the Potomac line, to protect Harper's Ferry that was under Confederate hands. And so Strasburg was hustling, bustling with troops. It was a town of about maybe 500 people at the most at that time. And they camped on Hupp's Hill, mostly because it was out of town a little bit. It was heavily wooded on the west side of the pike. And it continued as a campground throughout the war. In 1862, General Banks, Nathaniel Banks, in March decided to move on south. He got the orders that, we're on to Richmond, on to Stanton, and they occupied Strasburg, built Banks Fort where the water tower is now. But he had close to 12,000 troops with him, just in his division, camped all around Strasburg. They all didn't camp on Banks Fort. They camped all over Hupp's Hill. That's where the woods were, that's where the water was. So there again, it was occupied. And then, the town would be guarded by provost. They usually had a picket out in front, which would have been there at where the Strasburg High School is now. That was often used as the picket or forward lines for the Union Army when they were in the area. Later on that year, the Valley Campaign happened, going back and forth, and Hupp's Hill was always a scene of activity. Later on that year, after the Battle of Antietam, when General Lee's army moved back into the Shenandoah Valley, they stayed here for a month or more. They were all over the valley, mostly because of procurement issues. They had to spread out that vast number of men, 50,000 men. In fact, there was more men in the army than there was people who lived here at one time. And so D.H. Hill's division camped at Strasburg, first out along the railroad to the east, and then later they moved to Hupp's Hill. So that occupation lasted until Lee's army finally moved east of the Blue Ridge, and later on, the Battle of Fredericksburg happened. I'm an old artifact hunter, and a lot of places there was larger battles, Fredericksburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, but no place was occupied, not many places were occupied much longer than the Shenandoah Valley. Winchester was constantly under either Confederate occupation or Northern occupation. So that's why so many artifacts have been found in the Shenandoah Valley. Somebody was constantly here, constantly moving back and forth, and the population suffered from it over time because they all had rail fences. Well, those rail fences would disappear for firewood. And they said, only take the top rail. Well, you take the top rail and guess what? There's another top rail. So all the fences disappeared. The woods started deplenishing because it takes a lot of troops, to keep warm. It takes a lot of wood. In fact, I just read an article, something the other day, that they had 300 cords of stacked wood at Harper's Ferry to keep the Union Army warm one winter. 300 cords, just stacked at one time. So a lot of not only the crops, but the forests in the area also were depleted. 1863, the latter part of it, well, of course, after Gettysburg, the same thing happened, but 1863, there weren't that many Union troops in the area. The focus then was around the Rapidan line, Central Virginia, and General Meade had moved his Union Army over there, and General Lee, of course, is holding back. But there was some forces here in the valley. It was General M. Bowdoin's cavalry mostly was holding the line. And General Benjamin Kelly, who was in charge of the district for the Union Army, he may have been out of Cumberland, but he had a wide district that he was in charge of. He decided they were going to attack Stanton, go around the flank and through West Virginia, in other words, and go around the flank and destroy the railroad supply line that was at Stanton. Remember, there's no railroad between here and Stanton because it had been torn up, for one thing, at Mount Jackson. So a diversionary force was sent down from Harper's Ferry consisting of about 1,700 men and one artillery battery. It was the 34th Massachusetts Regiment, the 12th West Virginia Regiment, and the 1st Battery of West Virginia Artillery, 1,700 men, but They had 40 wagons with them. Said it's 2 miles long. Now, 1,700 men, and one cavalry regiment as well, which was the 1st New York Cavalry. So you got two Union regiments, infantry regiments, one cavalry regiment, 40 wagons, and one battery, 2 miles long. So can you imagine how long these other armies would have been coming through? It would have taken them days to pass down Main Street of Strasburg. They were acting as a diversionary force for General Averill's command that was coming in behind Stanton. Well, they didn't make it because General Early was sent over. Word got out this is happening. General Lee sent General Early over with 2 brigades, one from Georgia and one from Tennessee, and they held Stanton. So here's General Wells, or Colonel Wells was in command of the diversionary force that stopped at Hupp's Hill, of all places. They stayed there for 4 days in bad weather. And then they decided to move on to Harrisonburg and leave the wagons, which they did. I mean, light marching orders, it was called. They got to Stanton, I think it was December the 16th, 17th, something like that. And lo and behold, here comes General Early down the road, and with outnumber them. So they beat it back to Strasburg. They made it in a day and a half, forced marching. And they'd been on short rations anyway. And they had left all their supplies on Hupp's Hill in boxes and boxes of hardtack crackers. And they were really looking forward to it. Well, when they got there, only thing they found was a bunch of dead cows. The cows had gotten into the cracker boxes, ate the crackers, and if you know anything about livestock, they can't feed them that, they bloat it up. So this farmer comes up and he's complaining and he wants money for his dead cows. And I have no doubt it wasn't George Franklin Hupp that probably was the one that happened to. So anyway, the Yankees did get on back to Harper's Ferry and safely for that time. Next thing that happens is, of course, the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. It begins with the Newmarket advance and General Sigel. And he's slow and he marches, stops at Strasburg, and he slows down and stops at Woodstock. But that gave the Confederates time to, send in reinforcements. And of course, the Battle of Newmarket happened on May the 15th. And General Sigel retreated back through Strasburg and stopped at Hupp's Hill and Cedar Creek. This was going on all through the summer of 1864, and by that time the war had really gotten to be serious. It's almost like Ukraine. Couldn't be that bad, but it was bad, and particularly on the people that lived here. The next advance to Hupp's Hill was in August of 1864, when General Sheridan now had command of the army, the Union Army, and General Early was back. He was a Confederate of the 2nd Corps that had been sent over to the valley by that time, and he'd already advanced into the outskirts of Washington, and they'd had a battle, and he had retreated back and forth. And in fact, that whole summer, I think I counted, there was at least 22 skirmishes and major battles that happened during that time period. And I'm not counting the little small affairs. I'm talking about where there's brigades and several thousand men involved. But the Confederates came out on top on most of these battles. They won 15 out of the 22 battles. They could claim that they're victories. And August the 15th, there again was another one. The main defensive line was at Fisher's Hill, but General Early was holding Hupp's Hill, the high ground. And August 15th, General Sheridan sends 2 regiments to Signal Knob to capture the signal station there. August 15th, 1 regiment, the 116th Ohio, I'll mention it here again in a minute, went up that hill twice that day. And later on, a soldier in the regiment said that he always, anytime he was thirsty, he remembered that day, because he said, I was never so thirsty. He said, we drank water out of the mud puddles because it rained the night before, but they were young guys. I guess they could do it. But the soldiers on Hupp's Hill could see the fight going on for Signal Knob. A month later, Battle of Winchester happened, and the Confederate Army this is their first major defeat in the valley. They retreated to the Fisher's Hill line. Hupp's Hill was a forward position. They didn't have the strength to hold it anymore, so they retreated all the way back to Hupp's Hill. And General Sheridan's used Hupp's Hill to screen the 8th Corps, the woods that were still there. And later that day, or the next day on August or September 22nd, General Cook's 8th Corps was able to, using all the woods and ravines and everything, advance around the Confederate left flank to Little North Mountain and come in late in the afternoon on the 22nd and overwhelm the Confederate Army that was there. And it was another major defeat within 3 days. And they lost another 1,500 men, most of them captured. So for the first time, Sheridan got beyond Hupp's Hill, and he was able to advance to Harrisonburg and all the way down to North River at Bridgewater and Mount Crawford. And by this time, General Early is at the foot on the other side of Waynesboro, at the foot of Brown's Gap. And Sheridan thinks he's did enough, and his supply line stretched anyway, and Mosley's behind him, burning up all the wagons, and he decided to retreat down the valley, but they did the scorched earth policy in reverse. And they burned everything from Harrisonburg back to Strasburg for the most part. All the barns, all the livestock was driven off. They talked about miles and miles of livestock and just whatever they could bring with them. And they stopped, of course, at Fisher's Hill and on October the 10th and October 9th, and the Battle of Thomas Brook occurred between the two cavalry factions on either army. The Confederates lost that battle. But instead of advancing, Sheridan continued to retreat. He went to the Cedar Creek line, which they had actually been, every time they passed up and down the valley, they were digging in there as well. It became a defensive position or fallback position for the Union Army. Well, knowing General Early, he didn't let that go. He followed Sheridan back down the valley. And on October 13th, Sheridan didn't really know where Early was. Early reached Strasburg. And with his whole command, they went out to Hupp's Hill, where they could see the Union Army encamped on the high grounds across Cedar Creek. And they were hiding in the woods, the Confederates were, and the Union Army thought when they were being fired on by this one artillery battery that Early had sent out, they were eating dinner. And all of a sudden these artillery shells started falling in their camp. And well, we're going to go get that battery. So they sent General Wells out again with his 34th Massachusetts and his brigade, and he sent General Harris's brigade out, which was mostly West Virginians. And they didn't know all the Confederates were hiding in the woods behind Hupp's Hill. Well, they were going to capture this battery, and I'm thinking it's just about, if you're familiar with Route 11 out there, it's about where the Sales is, the two brothers. Well, it's about where Oxbow Road is. It goes down over the hill. That's about where they were set up, and that's a high spot, and right below it is a stone wall. Well, as the Union Army is advancing on the Confederates, all of a sudden they're being popped at with the cannons. They see more Confederates there, so they rush to the stone wall. It's like Kernstown all over again. The Union Army gets there first, and they halt the Confederates coming on, who were actually South Carolinians and belonging to Kershaw's division. And for all the time that the Confederate Army had been up and down this road, it was the first time that this particular Confederate brigade was in this area. They'd always passed either through Front Royal or some other route. That was the first time they were here at Strasburg, as far as that brigade of South Carolinians. They didn't know the terrain as well, and they were surprised when the Union Army popped up and shot a volley at them, numbering quite a few. In fact, Colonel Rutherford was shot in the belt buckle of the 3rd South Carolina. He died the next day. There was a captain in the same command who saw the fellow that shot Colonel Wells, and he ran forward and shot this guy. And his name was, I have it here, Archer. And today he's in the National Cemetery. So that's 2 people that died in that battle that you definitely put names to. I'll get his name right here. Anyway, it was quite a little battle. There was more men lost in that battle than was lost at Fisher's Hill, as far as on the Union side. And General Connors also was wounded in that battle that day. And it was later in the afternoon, it was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon when this happened. The one brigade, Harris's brigade, had retreated because they'd got the orders to, and Wells' brigade didn't get the order. And they're being overwhelmed down over the hill behind the stone wall. They were flanked from both sides. And Colonel Wells got shot right in the breast, and he died the next day. And he never made it to be general, but he got a commission that posthumously. Anyway, the Confederates are chasing the retreating Union Army, and Connor's out there on his horse trying to stop him when a shell goes off. Another artillery shell from the Union battery goes off, knocks him off his horse, and he was injured in the leg. The Confederacy could ill afford to lose any soldiers, any officers in particular at that time. They'd already lost their 2 top commanders in that one brigade, Connors and Rutherford. They left the whole brigade under command of a major. And at that time of the war, both sides had suffered from attrition, and a lot of times it was either the captains had moved up to command a regiment, the sergeants or corporals were commanding companies, and it was just a waste of bands, what it was. But for the Battle of Hupp's Hill, there was 150 Confederates casualties that day and 265 Union casualties, just for a short 30-minute fight. Now, where this occurred, a lot of people think it happened right up here where the trenches are, but really where it occurred was out about where I-81 happens and intersects with Route 11. And I think Connors was probably shot about where the Hampton Inn is now. I think that's where he may have been when he was wounded. The next event that happens is 6 days later, Battle of Cedar Creek. And because of Hupp's Hill, the 6th Corps, which had been on the 13th, was over in Front Royal, had been called back to Richmond. They were going back to Richmond to reinforce General Grant. Because of the consequence of the Battle of Hupp's Hill, the 6th Corps was sent back, and they were at Cedar Creek on October 19th. Now, there's some debate whether they were coming back anyway or not, but from what I've read, because of Hupp's Hill and some other indications that the Confederates were in the valley, 6th Corps, which is that was the largest group of manpower in the Union Army. It was about 10,000 men came back along with some cavalry. Otherwise, General Early probably would have won the Battle of Cedar Creek. But that's the way things happen, and sometimes for the best. After Cedar Creek, the Union Army occupied Hupp's Hill for probably the next 2 weeks, and that's when the breastworks were built that you see there now. At one time, they probably were extended across the crest of the hill for half a mile. The quarry took out a lot of them in the 1930s and 40s, those quarry operations. They're still visible where the Hupp's Hill Museum is now, but and there's a trace of them right behind Food Line. There's a field there, an open place. If you go up there now, you can see the trench line going across that field between the Food Line and, was it First Virginia Bank or whatever, City Bank. It's on City Bank property, but the trenches are still there. Not very visible, but I think the ones at the museum were more enhanced anyway during the 1920s when it was a tourist attraction. Because if you ever try to dig on Hupp's Hill, the ground's hard, and what they most likely did was cut down trees and throw dirt over top of them, and that was the most likely the means of breastworks. So even during the occupation of Hupp's Hill, there were some soldiers that died from disease. One fellow in the 1st Maine Regiment died on October 28th, and the records show that a couple years later, when all the soldiers' remains were picked up and reinterred at the National Cemetery, his records show that he was buried on the Hupp farm. And he was only 18 years old. So up until that time, you can see Hupp's Hill was constantly in the took a big part of the war that took place here in the valley. As time went on, the war faded. In the 1920s, the realignment of Route 11 took place, which the older pike went around the hill to the east a little bit to the left, and you can still see a trace of it where it was paved. But in the 1930s, it came straight down over the hill to its present alignment. And that took out a stone barn that was at the base of the hill in front of the mansion. There was an old stone barn there that VDOT took out. And in fact, there's part of the highway still left. It's that dip. It goes down and up. As you're making that turn, if you go down and up, that's as you're coming on to Massanutten Street, that's part of the old alignment of the highway. And I don't think so. Actually, if the highway went different locations over time, if you right across from Food Line now on the west side of the pike, you can see an even older trace that's eroded. So that was used at one time. So a lot of times they'd have a high road and a low road. Bad weather, you'd use a high road. Low weather, you'd use a lower road. But the pike has moved back and forth over time all along its alignment between here and the Potomac. In fact, Strasburg is the first place that you can see the Shenandoah River. If you're coming from the Potomac down Route 11, here's the first place you actually come view the Shenandoah River. 1920s, the land's still in the Hupp family. And there's an article in 1921 that Mrs. Hupp, Anna Hupp, I believe her name was, and her son were going to open up the caverns. The caverns, they'd known it for a long time. Soldiers had left their names in there, supposedly. But in the 1920s, they were going to open it up into a tourist attraction. And that's what it was for a long, long time, up until probably the 1960s. And there was a real early museum there, wonderful museum from what I understand, before my time. They had an early Valley wagon in there, Conestoga wagon, and all kinds of artifacts, Indian and artifacts, and probably a lot like our Strasburg Museum is now. That's a great museum. And Hupp's Hill Museum is, the current museum mostly focuses on the Civil War. So it's still a tourist attraction. And if you haven't been there, you should go. Go to both museums. Time about up?
You're going 36.
Okay, I'll
Keep it a little
I'll make it a little bit. I'll get you in a second. Anyway, I'm just have seen the changes in the last 25, 30 years of what's happened on Hupp's Hill. And I mentioned earlier what a wonderful panoramic view it used to be, and it's very much diminished now. So I hope future town planning takes that concept to heart and tries to preserve what viewshed there is for the future. It's important. I mean, asphalt and concrete generally went out. You know, they usually do. But we got to remember that people died there, and it's worth keeping, worth remembering. Okay. Bill?
Mike, you said the quarry wasn't built until the 30s, so it was not there during the war.
No.
Okay, so it was flat on top, because early pictures of what I've seen is where the carnival or what have you up there, it looked like it was treeless pretty much.
It was a lot of open area.
In the 40s and 50s, they had the carousels and the roller rink and all that up there.
Yeah, it was a tourist trap, that's for
Yeah.
sure. They had a zoo there.
Of course, the cabin, they had a place up there.
You could wrestle a bear, and they had a lot of entertainment. But
The quarry was not there during the war, which gave them a better camping.
yeah, the quarry was actually part of the woods.
Yeah.
I don't know, it was like 50 acres of woods back in there at one time that kept shrinking. But the quarry took out a lot of it. I believe the first quarry around Strasburg was the Powhatan Quarry, which is out at the junction, and then, I'm not sure, Standard Quarry, I think was the name of the one on Hupp's Hill.
Quarry that run down the valley.
So that's, unfortunately, you know, that's fed a lot, the quarries have fed a lot of people, put a lot of bread on the tables, but it's tore up a lot of our countryside around here.
There's going to be a Lake Shenandoah soon.
The quarry is?
It runs, you know, it runs from Miranda.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, it's a big, huge aquifer underneath there, and it's,
It's going to fill up the water one day.
but it's some of the richest limestone in the world is right there, the high calcium carbonate. Yep.
Pure,
Yep. Do you have a question?
Yeah, while your classmates and us were wasting our time, you were out with a metal detector. You must have had dozens. I've repaired 6 of them for you, I'm sure. But have you found things of interest up there?
Well, that's something I was going to mention. It seems like all the boys in Strasburg, except he was always in electronics, so he didn't do it, but we explored the caves.
Yep.
Used to find what was called the little diamonds up there, the Herkimer diamonds up there, and you still can if it rains and you walk out and you'll see a little sparkle. There'll be a little crystal there. They're shaped like diamonds. It's one of the few places in the world you can find them. So the boys would, and the old farmers would find artifacts. I mean, even to this day, if you're lucky, there's not that much ground that's left that's cultivated anymore. You can still find something, but I metal detected, and right behind the bank, or city bank, there's a sinkhole. It's still there. It's been partially filled in. Well, in the 1970s, I metal detected there, and I found ration cans and cartridge box cans, and the ground at Hupp's Hill preserves metal pretty well. For some reason, it must be neutral or not very acidic, but it preserves metal, and it still had the tin on it. Still, you know, it hadn't rusted. Somebody dig out that sinkhole, they would get a lot of artifacts to this day.
We'll meet there next Saturday with shovels.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of junk. There's a lot of tin cans and bottles and junk because of the dump as well. But there's Civil War artifacts in that sinkhole, and that's something that the old farmers always did. Was, you know, that was the first landfills around were sinkholes. You know, so. But in recent years, a lot of that land has been developed, but there's still artifacts there. Right across from the shopping center, and next to Arby's, there's a little field there, and we found South Carolina buttons in there, probably from that battle. And
Jimmy
this,
Troxell's got a pretty good collection of artifacts that he's found.
who's that?
Jimmy Troxell.
Yeah. The soldiers that died there on the southern side were buried at the Presbyterian Church. There's 136 soldiers buried there, unknown, but actually some of the names are known. It's just their graves aren't identified. But most of the South Carolina soldiers are buried there at Strasburg that died at Fisher's Hill or Hupp's Hill.
Speaking of these battles all over the place, I couldn't help thinking of the people living in this town. And what were they doing while this is going on all around them?
Yeah, it's a war scene, but they got used to it, and that's what's sort of driven home lately, watching the scenes on Ukraine.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good time for the local people. And Richard talked about us something this morning that I wasn't here, but I'd heard the story before about how bitter the war got and how personal it was getting at the end. So even though it's been 155 years or more, it's still here, and we shouldn't forget. You know, I know it's modern interpretations. Look at the war was fought for this reason or that reason. It doesn't matter. It was fought. It was history. People died. For what? Yeah.
You know, when we moved here in 1970, and after we've been here a little while, it occurred to me that I could still see the impact of the Civil War on
Yeah.
this whole area.
Yeah.
And it was really stunning.
It took 100 years to get over it.
Yeah, it was still reverberating, just in abandoned buildings. You just still feel it in the
Well, you were only 3 generations removed, and now we're 5 or 6, and that's with the further. You know, we're starting to get away from that living history. You know, we have it. You know, people my age, because we knew people who lived in. But the modern generation, it's 5, 6 now, and they're really starting to lose its familiarity. The stories keep getting forgotten. So the land keeps disappearing, what it looked like. And yeah, Bill.
I always thought one of the legacies of the fact that this whole area changed hands, was the closed mouth. You're not going to get an opinion. You could not. He sent out all the opinion. You would not get an opinion.
That's right.
Because they didn't know from one day to the next. Yeah, and I think that they just inherited that closed mouth. You know, I'm not going to be shot by a Yankee or a Confederate.
What, Bill?
I'm not shot.
Yeah, a couple of quick anecdotes. You mentioned Fisher's Hill. There was an unknown colonel, I believe he was back then, named George Armstrong Custer, who was part of the force that ran Bugle early off the hill. Another story is the Colonel Jackson, who was part of the Great Train Raiding. He was a Colonel Stonewall Jackson. But the other story I found, he was sitting in front of the Colonial Hotel with a chair, leaning back asleep, waiting for his troops to come in from Front Royal. And they saw him, so they went by
Real quiet.
so they wouldn't wake him
Yeah.
up.
There's a lot of stories, but you know, we live in a beautiful area, historic area, going back, you know, even before there was history. But progress is great. We need it, but let's do it with common sense and some sort of make it blend in. In the old days, people, they built the house themselves. They could take their time and build it, and they were proud of it. Now you put up the house real fast, make as much money as you can, and people live in it for 5 years and then they flip it. So we've lost somewhere along the way. We've lost our way.
And the house falls down.
Yeah.
Years
So,
It's really true.
but also on the other hand, it's great to look out and see this.
Give this man a hand. Good job, y'all.